Born in Brooklyn, Massachusetts, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was one of America's greatest presidents who served in the 20th century. His triumphant compromise with Khrushchev, leader of former Soviet Union, averted the Cuban Missile Crisis and avoided nuclear war, while tragedy of one of our greatest leaders loomed in his near future with his assassination that took place on November 22, 1963. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born on May 29, 1917, to a wealthy family in Brooklyn, Massachusetts. He was given the nickname Jack and was the second oldest out of the 9 kids Joseph and Rose Kennedy had. Joseph dreamed that one of his sons would enter politics. In 1920, when Jack was only 2.5 years old, he became sick with scarlet fever. There were no medications to help cure it, so everybody thought Jack would die. After he did end up surviving the fever, he still grew up sick. At one point, his parents thought he had leukemia, but he actually had a form of colitis, which is an intestinal problem. Apart from that, he grew up very active in sports. Now let's flash forward several years, and Jack actually became a Harvard graduate. Soon after he graduated, he became a part of the Navy in World War II. Here's Joe Blevins, the Phoenix City Assistant Superintendent, to inform you why he decided to join the Navy.
Well, in the times, you got to go back to the times after he graduated. World War II, was just breaking out, and so it was almost a patriotic duty to do that. He actually joined the Naval Reserves prior to World War II breaking out, but his father was an ambassador to England at the very beginning of the war, before the United States got in. And Kennedy actually wrote some papers, one paper I think right out of college or just toward the end of college, where he advocated for the United States being in the war. And this was prior to Pearl Harbor, which was, some people wanted in, some people wanted to stay away, isolationism because of World War I. But once Pearl Harbor happened, it was the patriotic thing to do. He had an older brother who was a pilot as well, Joseph Jr.
While he was in the Navy, he was given the command of a PT-109 torpedo boat. Jack was awarded for heroic conduct while in the Navy, and the story behind that is pretty amazing. On August 2nd, 1943, Jack's boat was rammed by a Japanese warship and was split in half. The impact killed 2 of his crew members and left him and the rest of his crew stranded in the middle of the ocean. One of his crew members was knocked unconscious. Jack grabbed onto the man's life vest, clenched the strap between his teeth, and led the rest of his crew to a nearby island for safety. They stayed there for several days until being found and taken home. Unfortunately for Jack, he was diagnosed with Addison's disease when he returned home. This means his body wasn't producing enough adrenaline. Doctors gave him steroids to help him with this, but they eventually ended up weakening his back. He didn't let this stop him. Since Joe died, it was up to Jack to go into politics, and he joined Congress.
Being in politics was supposed to be his older brother's thing. His older brother was kind of raised to do that, to be the politician of the family. His brother died in a bombing mission during World War II, I think in 1944, if I'm not mistaken. So when the brother died, next man up. He's the next son in line, and so he started being groomed for that. In fact, after World War II, he ends up being a U.S. representative from Massachusetts. He goes on to be a senator from Massachusetts. So it kind of was in the family, and he kind of it was almost forced on him once his older brother passed away.
He had one of the worst attendance records and had very few accomplishments there. As soon as he was elected, he started aiming for higher in office. Finally, in 1960, Jack was elected to be the United States' 35th president. Many people thought he wouldn't be elected because he was either too young or didn't have enough experience. He ran against Richard Nixon and beat him by less than 120,000 popular votes. This was Jack's greatest accomplishment, and he was amazed at what had happened. Just a few months after he was elected, in April of 1961, Fidel Castro was invading Cuba, and Jack tried to help some Cuban rebels defeat Castro and his army. All in all, this operation was known as the Bay of Pigs and was a failure for Jack.
It hurt him right out of the gate. Remember now, he's elected in 1960, November of 60. He takes office in January of 61. Bay of Pigs is April of 61, so he's only been in office a few months. Cuba was becoming a communist nation at the time when the Bay of Pigs invasion happened, and Kennedy didn't sign off on the air support that the military wanted for it. It damaged him both politically and with the military as well.
He knew he had to redeem himself, and his chance for that came a little while later in 1962, when nuclear missiles were found on a launch pad aimed at the U.S. and Cuba. This became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. In fear that this could turn into nuclear war, Jack didn't get the military involved. Instead, he turned the issue into a government operation and formed a blockade around Cuba. This blockade was basically a quarantine, but quarantine is a military term, so they had to call it a blockade. This blockade was formed so no more missiles could be brought in or for whatever reason be brought out of Cuba. After many negotiations, Khrushchev, leader of the USSR, agreed to get rid of the missiles in Cuba as long as President Kennedy would remove his from Turkey. He did, and Khrushchev kept his promise and removed them from Cuba, and the Cuban Missile Crisis was over. There's not much going on from there, and not too long later, it was time for another presidential election. Jack decided to run again. He went to Dallas, Texas in 1963 for a conference. On November 22nd, he was tragically assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald, who was sitting in one of the upper windows of a school deposit center just behind Jack and his wife, Jackie. This shocked people all around the world. In conclusion, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was a great president who averted the Cuban Missile Crisis, a war hero, and he was also a great person. Thank you.